Number 10. The Phaistos Disc. Some discoveries become famous because they reveal a lost civilization more clearly. The Phaistos Disc is more unsettling because it does the opposite. Found in Crete in 1908, this fired clay disc covered in spiraling symbols looks at first like the kind of object history should eventually explain. It is physical, preserved, and visually striking. But that clarity of form only makes the deeper uncertainty worse. We can see it perfectly. We still do not know exactly what it says, what language it belongs to, or even what kind of text it was meant to be. That is what gives the disc its extraordinary power. History often depends on pattern recognition. If enough inscriptions survive, scripts can be compared. If enough bilingual texts appear, meaning can slowly be unlocked. But the Phaistos disc stands in a more isolated position. Its symbols are stamped in a way that already feels unusual, almost like an ancient experiment in reproducibility, yet the text itself remains too singular to solve with confidence. The object is close enough to writing to provoke reading, but distant enough from understanding to resist it. And that is where the real mystery begins. Was it religious, administrative, ritual, literary, magical? Did it preserve a hymn, a prayer, a list, a game, a formula, a proclamation? Every possibility says something different about the world that made it. That is why the discovery raised more questions than answers. The disc did not merely add one more artifact to Minoan-era archaeology. It introduced a whole communicative act from the ancient world without giving us the key to its intention. What makes this especially haunting is how complete the object appears. It is not a few broken signs on a fragmentary shard. It feels whole, deliberate, composed. The symbols spiral inward with such precision that the disc seems to promise meaning through design alone. It looks like a message that wanted to endure. And perhaps that is the darkest part of it. Something was carefully impressed into clay so it could survive, and it did survive, but not in a form the future could easily receive. There is also something deeply strange about the stamped characters themselves. Writing is often imagined as the trace of the hand, but here the signs appear repeated through pre-made stamps, giving the disc a strangely mechanical aura for the ancient world. That peculiarity only intensifies the uncertainty. If the technique is unusual, does that mean the text was rare, ceremonial, or produced in a special context? Was this an isolated object, or the last survivor of a much larger tradition that vanished almost entirely? That is why the Phaistos disc belongs on this list. It is not mysterious because it might be fake in the dramatic popular sense. It is mysterious because even if accepted as real, it refuses the historical role people want discoveries to play. It does not stabilize the past, it destabilizes it. It reminds us that literacy, symbolism, and cultural expression in the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean may have been more varied than surviving evidence usually allows us to see. In the end, the Phaistos disc stands at number 10 because it captures one of history's most frustrating and beautiful forms of mystery. A discovery that seems as if it should explain something, but instead preserves the shape of a message while withholding the world needed to understand it. The clay survived, the certainty did not. Number 9. The Denisovans from Denisova Cave. Some discoveries change history because they uncover a lost city or forgotten object. The Denisovans are more unsettling because they were discovered through fragments so small they should almost have been invisible to history. A finger bone, teeth, traces of DNA from Denisova Cave in Siberia. These do not look like the ingredients of a major historical revelation. And yet from these slight remains emerged evidence of an ancient human group no one had previously identified in the way modern science now could. That is what makes the discovery so powerful. The past did not become simpler. Humanity itself became stranger. What gives this case its force is how radically it expanded the human story with so little material. A monumental discovery usually arrives through spectacle. A tomb, a temple, a ship burial. Denisovans arrived through genetic signal. Their existence, relationships, and spread had to be inferred through methods unavailable to earlier generations of archaeology. That alone makes the discovery feel uncanny. For centuries, people imagined the past yielding itself through visible ruins and dramatic artifacts. Here, the deeper truth came out of molecules preserved in bone. And that truth was deeply destabilizing. The Denisovans were not just another set of ancient remains to classify neatly. Their discovery revealed a more tangled human prehistory than many people had been carrying in their heads. Now there was another branch of ancient humans, interacting with both Neanderthals and modern humans, leaving traces not only in cave deposits, but in the genomes of living populations. The discovery did not only identify a lost group, it exposed how incomplete the previous map of human ancestry had been. What makes this especially haunting is the imbalance between evidence and implication. We know astonishing things from Denisovan DNA, yet physically they remain elusive. Their bodies are still far less familiar to the public imagination than Neanderthals. We can say they existed, interbred, ranged widely, and mattered biologically to later humans. But we cannot yet picture them with the same confidence people often want from a human ancestor. The result is unsettling. A real branch of humanity emerges clearly enough to transform science, while still remaining partially faceless. There is also something profound in the way the discovery reframed isolation. A cave in Siberia turned out not to be merely local evidence. It became a portal into a human story stretching across vast geographies and deep time. Once Denisovan ancestry was detected in living populations far from that cave, the discovery widened dramatically. One remote site was no longer just a place. It was evidence of a network of ancient movement, mixture, and survival that had largely escaped older historical imagination. That is why the Denisovans belong here. They are not mysterious because they are supernatural or exaggerated. They are mysterious because they prove that a major chapter of human existence remained hidden until technology became precise enough to hear it. And once heard, it raised questions that still remain unresolved. What exactly did Denisovans look like across different regions? How broad was their range? How many encounters with other humans occurred? How much of human prehistory still survives only as faint genetic whisper rather than visible historical form? In the end, the Denisovans from Denisova Cave stand at number 9 because they represent one of the most unsettling kinds of discovery imaginable. Not a lost object, but a lost people emerging from near invisibility to reveal that human history was never as singular, linear, or fully known as we like to think. The bone fragments were tiny. The questions they opened were enormous. Number 8. The Sutton Hoo Ship Burial. Some discoveries clarify a culture by giving it a face, a ruler, or a known historical name. Sutton Hoo is more unsettling because it revealed a world of astonishing richness without fully explaining whose world it was. When the ship burial was uncovered in Suffolk in 1939, it changed the way early medieval England could be imagined. This was no longer a dim, half-barbaric age waiting for later civilization to arrive. Gold, weaponry, regalia, artistry, imported luxury goods, and the ghostly outline of an enormous buried ship all pointed to a society of power, ritual, and symbolic sophistication. But the deeper revelation came with a problem. The burial was magnificent enough to demand identity and elusive enough to resist certainty. That is what gives Sutton Hoo its power. A ship burial is already emotionally charged. It suggests movement into death, elite passage, and a ceremonial relationship between rulership and the beyond. But here the grandeur of the burial came without the kind of neat documentary closure historians always want. The grave looked royal. The objects looked extraordinary. The site seemed to belong to the East Anglian world of kings. Yet the central human certainty remained frustratingly incomplete. Was this Raedwald, another ruler, a cenotaph, a politically symbolic burial whose exact identity has slipped away? And that is where the discovery raised more questions than answers. Sutton Hoo did not simply add treasure to a museum. It reopened the entire question of what so-called Dark Age Britain really was. If a burial like this existed, then older assumptions about poverty, isolation, and crude kingship had to be rethought. The site implied international connection, ceremonial kingship, military prestige, and an elite culture capable of astonishing visual language. In other words, the discovery destabilized the story by making the age richer and harder to simplify at the same time. What makes this especially haunting is the ship itself. The wood had decayed, but the impression remained in the soil. That gives the whole burial an eerie quality, as if the monument survived through absence. The vessel is there and not there. The ruler is present through objects and setting, yet partly missing as a stable identity. That double absence is central to the mystery. Sutton Hoo feels complete enough to transform history and incomplete enough to deny final explanation. There is also something deeply symbolic about the objects. The helmet, the shoulder clasps, the purse lid, the whetstone scepter, the weaponry, the imported silver. Everything suggests a ruler or elite figure standing at the intersection of war, ceremony, and long-distance political imagination. But the objects do not speak in one voice. They speak in many voices at once, pagan and Christian, local and international, martial and sacred. That complexity makes the burial harder to flatten into one simple cultural label. It suggests a world in transition, and transition is always more mysterious than the neat categories later people want to impose. That is why Sutton Hoo belongs on this list. The discovery solved one old question: whether early medieval England could produce monumental elite culture of this scale, but immediately opened a host of harder ones. Who was buried there? What precise political order gave rise to such splendor? How should we understand kingship, belief, and identity in a world where Roman memory had faded but new Christian and Germanic forms were still colliding and blending? In the end, Sutton Hoo stands at number 8 because it represents one of history's most beautiful forms of archaeological disturbance, a discovery that made the past suddenly more vivid, more dignified, and far less easy to explain. The ship burial did not illuminate one man alone. It illuminated an entire lost atmosphere, and then left historians to wonder who, exactly, had once been grand enough to fill it. Number 7. The Voynich Manuscript. Some discoveries become mysterious because they are fragmentary. The Voynich Manuscript is more disturbing because it is complete enough to look readable and alien enough to resist being read at all. That is what makes it so powerful. Here is a bound manuscript, filled with writing-like text, botanical drawings, strange diagrams, zodiac imagery, naked figures in impossible baths or tubes, and the unmistakable feeling that someone meant this book to communicate something coherent. It does not look like chaos. It looks like a system. And that is exactly why its silence feels so unsettling. What gives the Voynich manuscript its force is the way it occupies the border between language and refusal. If it were obviously random, the mystery would weaken. If it were clearly legible, the mystery would end. Instead, it sits in a painful middle zone. The script appears structured, patterns recur, words repeat in statistically suggestive ways. The pages seem grouped by topic or section. The manuscript behaves enough like a meaningful text to keep pulling people in, yet not enough like any known language or cipher to surrender its core. And that is what makes the discovery raise more questions than answers. The manuscript did not simply appear as an oddity. It appeared as a challenge to every category later scholars wanted to use. Is it a cipher? An invented language, a natural language written in an unknown script, a sophisticated hoax, a medical text, an alchemical work, a mnemonic device, a deliberately unreadable, esoteric object. Every attempted solution tends to illuminate one aspect while failing to account for the rest. The more closely it is studied, the more the manuscript seems to preserve the shape of intention without yielding the intention itself. What makes this especially haunting is that the book survives as an artifact of effort. Someone spent enormous labor on it. The illustrations were drawn carefully. The text was copied across page after page with consistency. Materials were gathered, the thing was bound. This was not a casual prank scratched into a margin. It was a project. That fact makes the mystery darker, because it means the manuscript was worth making even though the future cannot securely say what it was for. There is also something uniquely powerful about the manuscript's imagery. The plants resemble plants but often do not correspond cleanly to real species. The diagrams resemble scientific or cosmological charts, but remain resistant to firm interpretation. The human figures suggest medicine, bathing, reproduction, ritual or symbolic systems, but never settle fully into one explanation. The images do not simply fail to clarify the text, they multiply the interpretive field. Every page seems to promise that the key is nearby, and every page breaks that promise again. That is why the Voynich Manuscript belongs so high on this list. It is not just a puzzle. It is a discovery that exposes how much historical confidence depends on the assumption that writing, once preserved, can eventually be made to speak. The Voynich Manuscript attacks that assumption directly. It says a text can survive materially, look ordered, and still remain fundamentally withheld. In the end, the Voynich Manuscript stands at number 7 because it captures one of history's purest and most enduring forms of mystery. A book that looks like knowledge, behaves like knowledge, and may in fact be knowledge, yet continues to deny the world the basic mercy of knowing what kind. The manuscript was found. Its meaning was not. Number 6. The tomb of the Lady of Cow. Some discoveries become famous because they preserve the dead with astonishing clarity. The Lady of Cow is more unsettling because the preservation gave history a real person back, only to make her world more difficult to explain. When archaeologists uncovered her tomb in northern Peru, they did not find a vague legend or damaged remains barely capable of supporting interpretation. They found a woman of elite status preserved with extraordinary richness. Tattoos, regalia, weapon-associated symbols of power, and a burial context strong enough to challenge old assumptions about who could rule, command, or embody authority in Moche society. That is what makes the discovery so powerful. The tomb did not just reveal the past, it overturned expectations about it. What gave the discovery its force was the sheer material authority of the burial. This was not a case where a later chronicler might have exaggerated. The evidence was in the tomb itself. The woman had been interred with objects and ceremonial signs that suggested not passive high birth, but active political or ritual power. That matters because older frameworks often imagined ancient rulership and martial prestige too narrowly. The Lady of Cow did not merely add one more elite burial to the archaeological record. She forced historians to ask whether their earlier picture of Moche power had been too limited, too male-centered, or simply too dependent on assumptions the tomb no longer allowed. And that is where the discovery raised more questions than answers. If one woman could be buried with this degree of status and symbolic authority, what did that imply about the structure of Moche society more broadly? Was she exceptional or evidence of a wider pattern we had failed to see? How did gender, ritual, military imagery, and rulership interact in this world? Were there more women like her still undiscovered, or had archaeology simply not known how to recognize them? A single tomb became a challenge to an entire interpretive model. What makes this especially haunting is the intimacy of the remains. Tattoos on the body are not abstract prestige markers. They suggest lived identity, repeated symbolism, and embodied authority. The dead woman returned not only as bones and ornaments, but as skin, image, and personal presence. That degree of closeness changes the emotional texture of the discovery. She does not feel like a distant type. She feels like a person whose existence the old historical story had not prepared people to meet. There is also something deeply revealing about how tombs work in archaeology. A rich burial can seem like an answer because it provides objects, hierarchy, and visual drama. But tombs also distort by concentrating exceptional lives into extraordinary settings. The Lady of Cow gives us a rare elite moment preserved in near-theatrical clarity. That means she illuminates power while also complicating it. Was this burial representative, ideological, singular, or strategic? The tomb reveals enough to unsettle the past, but not enough to close the argument it opens. That is why the Lady of Cow belongs on this list. The discovery was not mysterious because the evidence was weak. It was mysterious because the evidence was strong enough to demand revision without being broad enough to complete it. The tomb told historians they had missed something fundamental. It did not tell them exactly how large that missed world really was. In the end, the tomb of the Lady of Cow stands at number 6 because it captures one of the most exciting and unnerving forms of historical discovery. The moment when the dead emerged from the ground, not just to fill in a gap, but to prove that the map itself was wrong. She was found. The world around her became harder, not easier, to understand. Number 5. The Rongorongo script of Easter Island. Some discoveries are disturbing because they preserve a message no one can yet read. Rongorongo is darker because it may preserve the remains of an entire intellectual world nearly extinguished before anyone could fully understand it. That is what makes it so powerful. The wooden tablets and inscribed objects from Easter Island do not merely present strange signs. They suggest the possibility of a graphic tradition, perhaps mnemonic, perhaps textual, perhaps something in between, surviving in fragments after the society that used it had already been devastated by disease, enslavement, colonial disruption, and cultural collapse. The script is mysterious, yes, but the deeper mystery is how much vanished with the people who once knew how to use it. What gives Rongorongo its force is the tension between visibility and silence. The signs are there. Repeated forms, ordered sequences, careful carving, recognizable structure. It looks deliberate enough to demand interpretation. Yet unlike scripts that were eventually cracked through bilingual inscriptions, abundant corpora, or surviving scribal traditions, Rongorongo remains stubbornly unresolved. That unresolved status does more than frustrate scholarship. It creates the disturbing impression of standing before a voice that survived materially while losing the world that could make it speak. And that is why the discovery raised more questions than answers. Was Rongorongo a full writing system, a proto-writing system, a ritual mnemonic aid, a genealogical device, a calendrical record, or something else entirely? How widespread was literacy, if literacy is even the right word here? Who learned it, who preserved it, and what kinds of knowledge did it hold? Every possible answer points toward a radically different understanding of Rapa Nui society. The tablets do not just ask to be deciphered, they ask us to admit how much cultural complexity may have been present before outside destruction narrowed the surviving evidence. What makes this especially haunting is the historical timing. European contact and the catastrophes that followed did not merely damage the culture in a vague sense. They broke the continuity through which explanation might have survived. That means Rongorongo is not only a technical puzzle, it is a monument to interruption. The script's silence is historical violence made visible. The undeciphered signs are not just hard to read, they are what remains after the chain of memory was cut. There is also something uniquely eerie about the tablets themselves. Carved wood is more fragile than stone, more vulnerable to fire, decay, mishandling, and disappearance. The survival of any Rongorongo objects at all therefore feels improbable and partial by definition. We are not standing before a monumental archive. We are standing before remnants. That fragmentary survival intensifies the mystery because each surviving piece feels like the edge of a much larger lost corpus. The script may appear mysterious partly because we are seeing too little of a tradition that once made more sense in broader context. And unlike some undeciphered objects that may be isolated curiosities, Rongorongo sits beside the Moai and the wider sacred landscape of Easter Island, which already suggests a society far more intellectually and ceremonially sophisticated than older stereotypes allowed. The script therefore deepens an existing mystery. It says the island did not only build astonishing monuments, it may also have maintained a system of recording or symbolic transmission that the modern world still cannot securely recover. In the end, the Rongorongo script belongs at number 5 because it represents one of history's saddest and most powerful forms of discovery, evidence of knowledge surviving after the conditions for understanding that knowledge have been shattered. The tablets were found, but what they once meant remains suspended between archaeology and silence, as if the past had left behind the outline of a language and then taken the key away with it. Number 4. The Vinland Map Controversy. Some discoveries are mysterious because no one can read them. The Vinland map is darker because people could read it immediately, and that only made the fight over its truth more destructive. That is what makes this case so powerful. On the surface, it seemed to offer an astonishing historical revelation. A map that might show knowledge of parts of North America before Columbus, tied to a medieval European context, and potentially reshaping one of the most emotionally charged narratives in world history. But almost from the beginning, the map became less an answer than a battlefield. What gave the Vinland map its force was not just the image itself, but what people wanted it to mean. A map is never only geography, it is authority in visual form. If genuine, the Vinland map would not merely add one more data point to medieval exploration. It would alter public imagination about who knew what, when, and how securely. That is why the controversy became so intense. The object did not enter a neutral scholarly world. It entered a historical culture already primed to attach enormous symbolic weight to precedence, discovery, and civilizational prestige. And that is where the mystery deepens. The map did not simply raise the question, did medieval Europeans know of Vinland? It raised harder questions about authenticity, material testing, provenance, forgery, desire, and the uncomfortable possibility that history's most exciting finds may tell us as much about modern hunger as ancient truth. Ink chemistry, parchment dating, textual comparison, stylistic inconsistencies, and debates over contamination or later addition all turned the map into something deeply unstable. The more it was studied, the less cleanly it behaved as either obvious treasure or obvious fake. What makes this especially haunting is how much the controversy revealed about scholarship itself. People often imagine that discovery ends debate. The Vinland map showed the opposite. A discovery can become most famous precisely because it destabilizes confidence in the process of proving anything at all. If a medieval-seeming map can attract serious attention, institutional backing, excitement, and then waves of forensic challenge, the real mystery becomes not just the object, but the threshold between evidence and wishful belief. There is also something uniquely modern about the case. This is not a buried Bronze Age object with no recorded history. It is an artifact that emerged into a world of laboratories, museums, headlines, expert reports, and public fascination. That should have made certainty easier. Instead, it made the controversy richer. Every new test appeared to promise closure, and every new argument reopened the interpretive wound. In that sense, the Vinland map belongs to a special class of discovery, the kind that becomes famous not for ending a mystery, but for proving how fragile historical certainty can be under pressure. And the emotional stakes are impossible to ignore. North America before Columbus is not a cold subject. It sits near questions of first contact, historical prestige, European memory, and the politics of who gets inserted into public timelines. The map therefore became bigger than itself. Even if one object failed, the longing behind it did not. That is one reason the controversy endured so fiercely. The map carried the seduction of shortcut history, one artifact that might rearrange a familiar story with dramatic elegance. In the end, the Vinland map controversy belongs at number 4 because it captures one of history's most unsettling discovery patterns, an object appearing to answer a huge question so dramatically that the question itself begins to swallow the object. The map was found, the certainty was not, and the longer the debate continued, the more the discovery seemed to reveal not a clean medieval truth, but the dangerous space where evidence, forgery, and historical desire collide. Number 3. The Dead Sea Scrolls. Some discoveries are mysterious because they reveal a lost machine or unknown people. The Dead Sea Scrolls are more unsettling because they opened a direct window into the religious world surrounding one of history's most consequential traditions, and that window only made the landscape behind it more complex. That is what gives the scrolls their extraordinary power. Found in caves near Qumran beginning in the mid-20th century, they were immediately recognized as monumental. Ancient biblical manuscripts, sectarian texts, hymns, commentaries, community rules, apocalyptic writings. This was not a single buried treasure. It was an entire textual world breaking back into history. What gave the discovery its force was the age and range of the material. The scrolls pushed surviving Hebrew Bible manuscripts far earlier than many previous witnesses and placed them beside documents from a Jewish world full of internal diversity, tension, expectation, and interpretive intensity. That matters because people often imagine sacred traditions as if they descended in one clean line. The Dead Sea Scrolls shattered that simplicity. They showed textual variation, sectarian commitment, legal argument, eschatological expectation, and a religious environment far more plural and alive than later streamlined memory tends to suggest. And that is why the discovery raised more questions than answers. At first glance, one might expect ancient scrolls to clarify origins. Instead, they complicated them. Which community produced or preserved them? How exactly should Qumran be understood in relation to the texts? How representative were these writings of broader Judaism in the Second Temple period? What do textual variants really imply about scriptural stability, transmission, and authority before later standardization? The discovery gave scholars far more material and far less simplicity. What makes this especially haunting is the proximity of the scrolls to later religious history. These are not distant Bronze Age curiosities. They belong to the centuries surrounding the birth of Christianity and the late Second Temple Jewish world. That means every new insight carries larger interpretive consequences. The scrolls illuminate a setting in which apocalyptic hope, scriptural interpretation, purity concerns, messianic expectation, and communal separation were already active realities. But illumination is not the same as reduction. Instead of giving one decisive missing key, the scrolls made the whole environment denser and more contested. There is also something powerful about the physical form of the discovery. Cave jars, brittle parchment, fragments pieced together over years, texts emerging from scattered ruins and markets. Everything about the scrolls carries the atmosphere of preservation on the edge of loss. We did not receive an intact library with labels and explanations. We received a wounded archive. That matters because fragmentary survival creates interpretive danger. Scholars must reconstruct worlds from pieces, and pieces can transform understanding while still refusing to settle every major dispute. And then there is the issue of access, which deepened the mystery in its own way. For years, the publication history of the scrolls helped generate frustration, speculation, and the sense that something historically explosive was being managed too slowly or too tightly. Even when exaggerated conspiracy claims went too far, the emotional truth remained. These texts felt too important to remain partially withheld. That delay fed the larger aura of the discovery, making the scrolls not only ancient evidence, but modern objects of tension over who gets to interpret the past first. In the end, the Dead Sea Scrolls belong at number 3 because they represent one of history's most profound discovery shocks, a buried textual world emerging to prove that the roots of scriptural tradition, communal identity, and religious expectation were richer, stranger, and less orderly than many people had imagined. The scrolls gave the world astonishing access to the past. They did not make that past easier to contain. Number 2. The Antikythera Mechanism. Some discoveries are mysterious because they preserve a lost text. The Antikythera Mechanism is more unsettling because it preserves a lost level of technological thinking. That is what makes it so powerful. Pulled from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, this corroded mass of bronze at first did not look like the kind of object that should rewrite intellectual history. But once researchers began to understand its gears, inscriptions, and astronomical functions, the shock became unavoidable. This was not just an ancient instrument. It was evidence that people in the ancient Mediterranean had built a machine of conceptual and mechanical sophistication far beyond what most later generations were prepared to imagine. That is what gives the mechanism its extraordinary force. Ancient technology is often pictured through architecture, sculpture, roads, or war engines. Impressive, yes, but rarely in the form of compact precision machinery that feels almost modern in spirit. The Antikythera device disrupts that mental picture completely. It suggests a world in which astronomical knowledge, mathematical modeling, craftsmanship, and mechanical engineering could be joined in one dense object meant to represent celestial cycles with astonishing sophistication. The discovery did not simply add one more artifact to Greek science. It exposed how incomplete our map of ancient technical capability had been. And that is why it raised more questions than answers. If such a device existed, how unique was it really? Was it an isolated masterpiece produced by one exceptional workshop, or the surviving remnant of a broader tradition of complex mechanical instruments now almost entirely lost? What other devices, texts, schools of engineering, or practical uses might once have existed and vanished? The mechanism did not just illuminate one object. It cast a disturbing light on the vast scale of technological disappearance history is capable of hiding. What makes this especially haunting is the context of survival. The mechanism was not preserved in a functioning workshop, with manuals, maker's notes, and surrounding examples lined up for explanation. It survived in ruin, broken and encrusted at the bottom of the sea. That means the modern world encountered it first as wreckage, not clarity. Even now, so much of its significance has had to be reconstructed through fragments, scans, gear analysis, and comparative inference. We know enough to be stunned. We do not know enough to stop wondering what the full technological landscape behind it once looked like. There is also something deeply unsettling about the object's relationship to time itself. The mechanism modeled cycles, eclipses, celestial movements, calendrical systems, turning the sky into something calculable through interlocking metal. That gives it an eerie symbolic power. An ancient machine survived to tell modernity that the past once understood the heavens through mechanisms more refined than modern people had believed possible. It is difficult not to feel in that moment that history has hidden not just a machine, but an entire lost confidence in how the cosmos could be grasped materially. And because the device appears so advanced, it tempts exaggeration in exactly the way the best discoveries do. People want to drag it into fantasy or treat it as impossibly out of place. But the real mystery is stronger than fantasy. The mechanism is not supernatural. It is historical. That is what makes it more disturbing. Human beings really did make this, which means human knowledge once reached this level, and then most of the evidence for that level almost entirely disappeared from ordinary memory. In the end, the Antikythera Mechanism belongs at number 2 because it captures one of history's most unnerving discovery patterns. The moment when a single artifact proves that the ancient world was not merely stranger than expected, but technically deeper than the surviving record had prepared us to believe. The machine was found. The civilization that made such a machine remains, in important ways, only partly recovered. Number 1. Göbekli Tepe. Some discoveries are shocking because they reveal lost sophistication. Göbekli Tepe stands at number 1 because it threatens the order in which many people unconsciously imagine civilization itself. That is what makes it so powerful. Here was a monumental ritual site in southeastern Anatolia, with massive carved pillars, animal imagery, symbolic density, and organized construction dating back to a period long before settled agricultural civilization was supposed to have fully taken the form many older historical models expected. The discovery did not merely add an early sacred site to the map. It opened the possibility that some of our basic assumptions about what came first in human social development had been too simple all along. That is what gives Göbekli Tepe its extraordinary force. For a long time, the broad story people told themselves ran in a familiar order. Agriculture stabilizes life, villages grow, surpluses develop, social complexity deepens, and then large ritual architecture emerges from that settled world. Göbekli Tepe complicates that sequence in a way that still feels almost disorienting. Monumental symbolic construction appears astonishingly early, and that forces a harder question. What if organized ritual gathering, sacred labor, and symbolic coordination were not late products of settled life, but part of what helped generate more complex social worlds in the first place? And that is why the site raised more questions than answers. If people at Göbekli Tepe could quarry, carve, transport, and erect these pillars at such an early stage, what kind of social organization made that possible? How were labor, belief, and leadership coordinated? What communities gathered there, and from how far away? Was the site a pilgrimage center, a regional ceremonial focus, a ritual landscape used seasonally, or something more difficult to classify within modern terms? Every answer seems to widen the problem rather than solve it. What makes this especially haunting is the emotional scale of the architecture. These are not accidental arrangements of stones later generations romanticized. The pillars dominate, the enclosures feel deliberate, the carvings carry symbolic seriousness. Everything about the site suggests a world already capable of concentrated meaning and shared ceremonial purpose. That matters because history often treats very early humans as if large-scale sacred imagination must have come later, after practical life had stabilized enough to afford it. Göbekli Tepe reverses the emotional hierarchy. It suggests that the sacred may have been central to building complexity, not merely decorative after complexity arrived. There is also something deeply eerie about the site's burial and reburial. Parts of Göbekli Tepe were intentionally filled in, preserving them in a way that still resists full explanation. This is one of the most haunting features of the whole discovery. The people who made the enclosures did not simply abandon them like ordinary worn-out structures. They buried them. That act introduces another level of mystery. Why close and cover a place so monumental? Was it part of ritual completion, social change, memory control, or something we still lack the framework to understand? The site survives partly because the people themselves sealed it away. And because Göbekli Tepe belongs to such deep prehistory, the discovery arrives with very little textual help. There are no chronicles explaining the builder's intentions, no doctrinal manuals, no royal inscriptions. That means the site speaks through stone, labor, placement, and symbolism alone. It is one of the purest confrontations between archaeology and human mystery, an undeniable reality large enough to overturn older narratives, but silent enough to keep the motive world behind it only partially visible. That is why Göbekli Tepe stands at number 1. It represents one of history's most radical discovery shocks, not just the finding of an ancient site, but the discovery that human beings may have been organizing sacred architecture, symbolic ambition, and collective labor at a level that forces us to rethink the deep origins of civilization itself. The stones were uncovered. The old story did not survive unchanged.